How do you feel when a game makes you do this? Or this? Or this? Earlier this year, I played The Last of Us for the first time, to get ready for The Last of Us Part 2. In my playthrough, there was a theme that kept coming up. Judgment of the player for taking part in the violent gameplay. The game's story kept criticizing the violence the character I was playing committed, and I couldn't help but feel it was trying to call me out for going along with it. And it wasn't just me feeling this. I started seeing people feeling judged by games that critique violence everywhere. All this made me wonder, what are game creators trying to accomplish with this? Do they really want people to feel like they've done something wrong by playing their games? The short answer is, well, yes.
We're starting to wonder about our enemy. Are we killing the people we came here to save?
What if they have families?
Everyone has a family.
The phenomenon seems mostly unique to video games. We have no problem watching movies, TV shows, or reading books that include and criticize violence. Not only are we okay with them, they are some of the most popular stories in the world right now. Just look at Game of Thrones, probably the biggest show in the world in 2019 with its last season. It's filled with grotesque violence and terrible people doing terrible things. And the show condemns these characters for the violence they commit. But we don't feel judged or attacked for being forced to take the perspective of these characters in the show. The judgment is targeted at the characters, not at us for watching the show. We are just along for the ride. We aren't doing anything. Games are a different, more interactive story. Because we actually have to do things in games, when a game gives the enemies we are killing names or heartbeats, or really anything that has to do with making killing people in the game feel more real, it can make us feel like the game is being cheap or manipulative. We feel backed into a corner when a game makes killing a dog or an innocent person unavoidable, just to have the game then yell at us,
"Gotcha! Look how terrible you've been. You just killed that person. Didn't you know killing people was wrong, you dummy?"
We are then left wondering, why? Why did the game make us do these things and then tell us that they shouldn't have been done? If it was the wrong choice, why didn't the game give us another, better choice? There's actually a pretty good reason why game creators do these things, and it has to do with this unique interactive aspect of games. I want to note here that some people think that the interactive aspect of games doesn't matter that much when it comes to their stories, and that we should just treat games like movies and not identify with the avatar's actions. The problem to them is that people are playing games wrong if they feel bad about what they are doing in them. However, as we'll see later on in this video, this is not how the developers of these games see them. They do want you to identify with the avatar's actions. So I'm not going to be talking about this view in this video. If this is how you play games, complete detachment from what you do in them, thinking of yourself just as an agency-less passenger along for the ride, good for you. You are unique. To really understand how we got here, and why some game creators feel the need to torture us for playing their games, we need to go back to the beginning. From the start, violence in games was controversial, even if this is what the violence looked like at the time. People thought back then it was wrong to have a player do something in a game that would be wrong to do in real life. The developers of Death Race defended the game, however, framing it as a joke, a cartoon. The violence was like that of Tom and Jerry, all in good fun, an exaggeration of just being a horrible driver. It wasn't real life, it was a caricature of real life. Even though graphics have improved over the years, this argument that games are just cartoony, harmless fun persists today as probably the most widely used defense of violence in games. In essence, this lack of realism, this absurd exaggeration of violence, is partly what makes us feel comfortable doing things we would never do in real life, in video games. Things like running over dozens of pedestrians in an ambulance, for instance, or burning down a villager's home. There's a comfort in the cartoonishness because it builds up a barrier between the real world and the fake world of video games. Yeah, it's murder, but it's just a game after all. All of this made games a great place to have fun and mess around, but a terrible place to have something taken seriously. Around 2012, game creators made a real effort to move away from games' cartoonish past and tell more mature stories. Spec Ops: The Line was released as a more mature version of a shooter, and The Last of Us was announced as a more mature version of a horror game. Games before this had elements of trying to move past the cartoonishness, like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2's No Russian mission. But Modern Warfare 2 only really had that one mission, and the rest of the game was still pretty cartoonish. The difference with Spec Ops and The Last of Us was that they were almost entirely focused on this more mature and serious kind of game. The Last of Us, for instance, was shown off at the very end of E3 2012, and it was framed very differently than most of the other violent games on display.
Some people have asked, like, it feels really shocking, it feels really violent, and if you think about it, we're not doing stuff that's really over the top compared to some other games, but I think it feels shocking because it's real. Because we make these guys feel human, it feels worse kind of dispatching them.
Naughty Dog had been making traditional and cartoonish, lighthearted violent games for years with its Uncharted series, but the writers for The Last of Us really wanted to move away from this type of game and tell stories like you'd find in critically acclaimed films.
When we look at this genre in film, when you look at like something like 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, they're all character driven, right? It's all about applying the pressure on the characters, forcing them to make difficult decisions that define who they are as people. Therefore, the story works so well because it's telling us who we are as people. And that to us is one of the strengths of this genre that no one has applied to in games.
The intense violence that was just for fun, seen in games like Uncharted, was out, and it was now going to be replaced by violence that served a more mature, story-driven purpose. The Last of Us and games like it created a new category in video games. One that was self-aware and critical of the violence the games themselves were participating in. These games were meant to be taken very seriously, with morally gray stories that asked us to reflect on how we were engaging with them. However, this new category of self-aware violent games couldn't easily escape the cartoonish past of games. They couldn't just do what movies and TV had done to tell more mature stories by just removing the cartoonish elements. These elements, like killing hundreds of enemies, experience points and progression systems, in a lot of ways are what makes a game for many people. And if you just add a typical mature story on top of this cartoonish gameplay, we have been conditioned over the decades to treat it like a joke and laugh at the deaths so we don't feel bad for the murder we commit. An example of this kind of game is Spider-Man Miles Morales. It has a serious story with fleshed out characters, but the gameplay is cartoonish. You aren't killing people, of course, but you would be giving them permanent brain damage if you did in real life what you were doing to them in the game. You can see how any attempt by the game's narrative to critique violence by making Spider-Man principally non-lethal rings hollow when you are swinging around doing this to hundreds, even thousands of people. But the thing is, I don't really care. The game is super fun and I enjoy beating these people up, even if in real life I would be causing these people permanent brain damage. The violence is too absurd to make me care about it. It's a joke, it's just for fun. And I'm not alone in this. In a lot of ways, we tend to play games like textbook psychopaths, with no empathy for the people in them and exhibiting extremely antisocial behavior. These new mature games needed to figure out how to change that while still keeping a lot of the typical cartoonish gameplay that everyone expects from games in order to have their critiques of violence ring true. It's a hard problem to solve. How do you make a player feel fear for a character when that character will just respawn when they die? Where is the tension? How do you make a player feel for the people they are killing when they are focused on racking up cool combos and gaining experience points and achievements? How do you make a single death meaningful when the gameplay of most games for generations has had players killing hundreds of people at a time? Video game creators were very aware of this problem when developing these mature games. The lead writer for Spec Ops: The Line said that he didn't believe that violent games make violent people or desensitize us to violence in the real world, but he did think that it desensitizes us to violence in games. It's not hard to find examples of the desensitized players these game creators are having to deal with. Just look at practically anyone making game videos on YouTube. Violence with no context that treats the people in games no different than crash test dummies.
So I hit an old lady and I shot a cop. I just shot someone in the head.
Running over dozens and laughing about it, punching or shooting random people on the sidewalk while giggling maniacally. This isn't the fault of the players. As I said before, people have been conditioned to not take violence in games seriously. Since the very first violent games, it's a mindset that is extremely hard to change, especially when that mindset and detachment from the real world may be the only thing making people feel comfortable being violent in games. So, how did game writers try to get past the desensitization problem? How did The Last of Us get us to care about Ellie and Joel and the people they were killing? How did Spec Ops: The Line get us to take a war game seriously? Well, it's pretty simple. They tried to bring the real world to the game world in the most shocking ways possible, make the violence impossible to dismiss as just a joke, unless the torture began. You think it's just a game? Well, let's see how you feel after you're forced to burn some children alive. I think it's important to understand how low the bar for player engagement has been set by this desensitization problem. Game creators have not been able to use the more nuanced methods in film and television to get players to feel specific emotions. They have been forced to use extremely blunt instruments with the one simple goal of just making the player feel the violence they commit. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2's designer Mohamed Alavi said about the mission No Russian that it isn't really relevant whether it makes you enjoy the entertainment experience even more because you're being naughty like Grand Theft Auto, or it engrosses you further into the story and makes you resent your actions. What's relevant is that the level managed to make the player feel anything at all. In the sea of endless bullets you fire off at countless enemies, without a moment's hesitation or afterthought, the fact that I got the player to hesitate, even for a split second, and actually consider his actions before he pulled that trigger, that makes me feel very accomplished. Walt Williams, lead writer for Spec Ops: The Line, echoes this exact same sentiment, saying, "We don't want the player to feel a specific thing. It's not designed to make you feel bad. The goal that we had going in was that you would just feel something." To really understand how these games are trying to get us to feel for the violence we commit, let's take a closer look at Spec Ops: The Line. The game shows you a more realistic war zone, something much closer to war in real life. It does this by giving the men you are about to kill backstories through conversations they have with each other. They talk about their lives, why they are where they are, and where they came from. It lingers on their deaths after you kill them, showing their gruesome deaths as realistically as possible. You hear their heart-wrenching screams as they clutch at bleeding stumps.
There's nothing we can do.
And the people around you constantly question whether it was the right decision to end their lives.
This was too much. Stop talking.
The game has you go from playing a soldier, like we'd see in any of countless war games, the good guy fighting for freedom and justice, to the unfeeling psychopathic mass murderer that we all are when we play these games. There is one mission that sticks out to me in Spec Ops: The Line that really shows all these methods for getting a player to feel something about their violent actions. You are approaching a group of enemies, wildly outnumbered, like is par for the course in shooter games. The only way to get past the enemies is to use white phosphorus, a chemical weapon that burns people alive. Your job is to target the enemies from behind a computer interface, which is metaphoric to how our TVs and monitors separate us from the people we kill in video games. You begin firing and taking out the whole group of enemies. When you are done, you leave the interface and turn off the screen. A typical war game would just move on to the next objective, the next battle, but Spec Ops doesn't do that here. You are actually forced to walk through the carnage you just rained down and deal with the consequences of your actions. Turn off the metaphorical screen and remove that cartoonish separation from violence that we are all so used to in games. We see people, not in absurd exaggerations of violence, but presented straightforwardly without being cleaned up or despawned. Just people burned beyond recognition, people dragging themselves across the ground, missing arms and legs, mangled corpses everywhere. What would be a fun accomplishment in a different game is a horrifying reminder of what the consequences of our bloodlust would look like in the real world. And the cherry on top of it all is that you begin hearing the enemy soldiers yelling at you, calling you murderers, that all they were doing was trying to help people, and you find out that in one of the buildings you burned, there's a mother holding her child covering their eyes, flesh burned off their bodies. And the thing is, this method for getting players to feel things about the violence they commit works. I was definitely feeling something after that mission, and it definitely didn't feel like just a game anymore. People were focus testing that scene, and they were pausing the game, and they were leaving the room, said Walt Williams. Some people were playing through it, waiting for it to be over, and they were being very kind of upset that this had happened, that we had put them through this particular moment. It was affecting people very emotionally. This is where the characters have to look at the consequences of their actions and say, should we have gone further? Should we have left? Should we leave now? Is it right to keep going? And if the player is thinking about seriously putting down the controller at this point, then that's exactly where we want them to be emotionally. The creators for The Last of Us tried to do something a little different from Spec Ops and Modern Warfare 2. They wanted to deal with the desensitization problem as well and get people to feel for the violence in their games, but they also wanted to do something more. They wanted to teach moral lessons. Co-director of The Last of Us Part 2, Anthony Newman, explained why they gave the enemies you killed in the game names, and how it helped tell their story of the cost of revenge. I think that makes it clear that these aren't just faceless goons that you're fighting against. These are real people who care about each other, and you are committing these heinous acts against them. I think that through the gameplay, this is what's so awesome about video games as a medium. This is something you couldn't do in film or any other way. You are complicit in these horrible acts, and it really drives home what this high cost of humanity is. So yes, game creators do want people to feel like they've done something wrong by playing their games, but it's only because they want us to just feel something, anything, about the violence in them. To stop for a moment in the blood and gore and think about the game world a little more like the real world. To buy into the characters as not just video game avatars and NPCs, but as real human beings. To stop playing violent games like psychopaths, or even in the case of The Last of Us, to teach us about the immorality of our actions. And so all these things that we might think are cheap, manipulative, or sometimes straight up mean all do serve a purpose, and they can make us engage with games more emotionally. The creators of these games aren't sadists. They are doing the best they can to tell meaningful stories under the less than ideal circumstances of players' desensitization to violence. But could this method of shocking people into feeling for video game characters by making the violence more real, although super effective, eventually lead people to be even more desensitized? Sure, Spec Ops: The Line was emotionally impactful in 2012, but would it do the same thing if released in 2020? The shock value might eventually have diminishing returns. This potential limitation to using hyper-real violence as a gameplay mechanic for emotional engagement may lead to game creators eventually needing to use another, non-violent mechanic to tell emotionally engaging stories about violence in the future. Walt Williams said of these diminishing returns that it's getting harder and harder for us to play these games and look at them critically and say, it's okay, this makes sense, and that he thinks games need to move past violent gameplay because creatively they're too easy. I think we're better than that. This brings up the issue of whether these games can even effectively criticize violence while still having violence be the main gameplay mechanic. We might feel worse about what we are doing in these games, but at the end of the day, we aren't really doing anything different in them than what we would be doing in normal violent video games that aren't self-aware. There's a real question here of whether an emotionally engaging murder simulation is any better than a straightforward, emotionally detached murder simulation. After all we are really able to do in these games is kill anyway. We aren't able to put into practice the lessons we are being taught. As Far Cry 3's writer says about its satirical critique of violence in games, the difference between it and the games it's trying to criticize can be hard to see. The truth is that it's just really hard to effectively criticize something by making it into a game. Whether the game is a satirical or sober criticism of violence, it can very easily become what it's trying to critique. In fact, it can even seem that the self-aware criticism of these games might just be a convenient way of justifying the violent gameplay everybody loves and can't live without. For instance, if you look at The Last of Us writer Neil Druckmann's Twitter, you see very little of the critical aspects of The Last of Us Part 2 on display, and much more cool kill compilations and idealization of the characters the game is critiquing. Idealization to the point of not being able to accept it when the writers make these characters face the consequences of their murder spree. And the violence that is supposedly to be taken seriously is instead treated the same as if it were in any other violent game. Just a challenge to be dominated. Yeah, this right here definitely makes me feel the human cost of revenge. But putting aside these questions of how effective these games actually are and are not at criticizing violence, there's still another problem. What about the people who aren't desensitized to violence in games? Would the intense, realistic violence keep them from playing these games? Maddie Myers, who wrote Polygon's review of The Last of Us Part 2, said, if you already think violence isn't the answer to many of the world's problems, the repeated lesson that killing is bad makes the game almost maddening. I don't have any problem empathizing with the people who I'm asked to kill in video games. The Last of Us Part 2 must think I struggle with it though, since it doles out all sorts of reasons why I should feel regret about the murder spree its characters have embarked upon. As we just learned, this is exactly what the people who created the game think. The author of this review just isn't in these game creators' target audience. And as more people start playing games that haven't before, this group of people that aren't desensitized to violence in games is only going to grow bigger. There's such a unique history with violence in games, and the developers of these self-aware games seem stuck in it. The gameplay is designed with people that have played games before in mind, and now the stories are as well. Accessibility with gameplay has definitely really improved recently, but I wonder if we don't need some improved narrative accessibility as well. If you haven't played many violent games, you just won't benefit from some of the things these self-aware violent games are trying to do. The playable characters can seem incoherent and unrelatable because they are written to be relatable to the psychopathic gamer, not the sympathetic one. The narrative can even become just too emotionally exhausting to get through, since you don't have a problem empathizing with the people that you are being forced to brutally murder. If people in a focus group for Spec Ops: The Line are thinking about putting down their controllers, when they most likely have had lots of experience with violent games, what do we expect someone with no experience with them to do? You might argue that people not desensitized should just play different games, but I would disagree, because I don't think we should be limiting some of the biggest games in the world to only people who have played a bunch of violent games and have become numb to them. I think games like Spec Ops: The Line and The Last of Us are an indicator of an awkward transitional phase in video games between games with cartoonish stories and cartoonish gameplay to games with mature stories and mature gameplay. Publishers have opened up game narratives creatively, giving them a lot of freedom, but seem to still be too scared to do much creatively with gameplay because, money. Leaving these games with mature stories and hyper-real violence as the only option for emotional engagement. The creators of Spec Ops: The Line were even asked by their publisher to change their slower gameplay to be closer to the intensity of Call of Duty because that's what they thought players wanted and expected. The publisher even had them add multiplayer, which the creators thought was an insult to the story that they were trying to tell, calling it a cancerous growth on their game. Another example of this is The Last of Us Part 2. The story changed immensely since the first game, but the gameplay changed almost not at all. And the one moment that it felt like things would be different, that the gameplay would move away from violence to be more exploration focused, the game cut it short and never really revisited it. The exploration felt like something the developers snuck in as a test to see what they could get away with, rather than a real attempt to break free from a sole focus on violence for gameplay mechanics. Which is sad, for as rich and dynamic as these stories these games are telling are, for the gameplay to be so one note, it's disappointing. But like I said, I do think these games are transitional, which makes me excited to see what's coming in the future, and what games like The Last of Us Part 3 will be. Maybe the developers will be given more freedom to explore non-violent gameplay that's accessible to more people, allowing them to interact with the amazing characters and beautiful worlds we all love so much in ways that aren't just hyper-realistic violence simulations.